if you give one species of plankton, you can accurately predict what species you'll find in the layers above it and what species you'll find in the layers below it. There is this pattern here.
What's up, everyone? Hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are. Today, we are jumping into a debate that honestly had me glued to my screen from start to finish because modern day debate hosted a showdown between Evidence of God, also known as Charles, who runs the Yahweh Science channel, and Grayson from Based Theory, tackling one of the most legendary questions in the Christian apologetics world. Did the flood of Noah actually happen? And what unfolds is a masterclass in how science and scripture collide when both sides actually show up prepared. Stick with me all the way through because the deeper we get into the geology and the fossil record, the more interesting this one gets. Some of the biggest moments are hiding in the middle where things really start heating up. And hey, do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from right now. I love seeing everyone checking in. It genuinely makes my day. Now let's get into it.
Okay, so a couple of points on that. One, I don't think it matters like what percentage of the atmosphere is oxygen in terms of like the integrity of a wooden boat in waves. Like the actual
It's
dynamic
lighter.
forces are not going to be that impacted by the oxygen composition of the atmosphere. And two, I did hear you say that historically oxygen was 35% of the atmosphere as opposed to like 21% today, but again, this is, I would consider to be cherry picking because you're looking at the max. You're looking back at the Carboniferous and the Permian eras. That's like the maximum amount of oxygen. But then after the Permian extinction, oxygen levels crater out. And when you have some of the largest like life forms that we've seen on our planets, like the dinosaurs, the oxygen levels were actually lower than today, like all through the Mesozoic. It was steadily climbing back up to the oxygen levels we have today. So like these things fluctuate from like 15% to like 30%. Like it fluctuates over geologic time. So over like between the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic, we see ups and downs in oxygen levels. It's not just this story that you've painted of, well, oxygen was so much higher back then, so everything grew so much bigger.
Yeah, so they say that because they have to account for the differences that they see in the geological column, right? If the oxygen was historically 35% oxygen from a biblical perspective, right? So if the Earth was if things were bigger, they lived longer. This is in line with the oxygen. We know that oxygen was historically higher at one point. Creationists, we put it before the flood, obviously. After the flood, Noah's age decreased. After the flood, things got smaller, right? After the flood, there were a lot of dramatic changes, like the gulo gene shut off, right? Like these all fit with the narrative of the oxygen, right? So the reason why we say 35% oxygen was out of that time is because we don't believe that there was billions of years of
Gotcha.
oxygen changes. So it's
So
got to be somewhere, right?
I would say that this doesn't fit with the actual evidence and data for oxygen levels in the past because it's not like you have pre-flood and post-flood. You have like in the middle of this flood, from your perspective, right? Because we're talking about a huge drop in oxygen between the Permian and the Triassic period. That's in the middle of those are both layers that are supposed to be laid down by the flood in the young Earth creation model. And so in the middle of this, you have these oxygen levels cratering. But then even when you go back before, like before the Carboniferous period, the oxygen levels go down. It's like a big spike in oxygen around the Carboniferous and the Permian era. And before and after that period, the evidence shows us that oxygen was less than today's levels. So I don't think that that fits neatly into the pre and post flood narrative.
So yeah, that could help with the buoyancies and everything that's observed in the fossil records, right? Like when you mentioned plankton as well, you say that, so water can organize sand grains, right?
Yeah.
So
This is where the whole young Earth argument starts bleeding from multiple wounds at once, and I want you to see exactly why. Because Evidence of God walks in with this confident story about oxygen being 35% before the flood, and how that explains why ancient creatures were bigger, lived longer. Everything fits so neatly. It sounds almost plausible on the surface, until Grayson does what a good scientist does and actually checks the data. Grayson said this: I did hear you say that historically oxygen was 35% of the atmosphere as opposed to like 21% today. But again, this is I would consider to be cherry picking because you're looking at the max, you're looking back at the Carboniferous and the Permian eras, and that is the moment the entire framework starts to wobble because you have to understand the 35% oxygen figure is real. Scientists do measure that, but it's the absolute peak of oxygen levels on Earth during one specific window hundreds of millions of years ago. What Evidence of God is doing is grabbing that single data point and waving it around like it represents the entire pre-flood atmosphere. That's not science. That's picking the one statistic that sounds good for your narrative. Then Evidence of God doubled down with this. If oxygen was historically 35% oxygen from a biblical perspective, so if things were bigger, they lived longer, this is in line with the oxygen. And here's what people don't realize. This whole bigger animals because more oxygen story has a massive hole in it. The largest animals that ever walked the earth, the sauropod dinosaurs, the giants that make your jaw drop when you see them in museums, they lived during the Mesozoic era when oxygen was lower than it is today. Not higher, lower. So the entire narrative that Evidence of God just laid out actively contradicts the fossil record he's trying to defend. You cannot square this.
So if it can organize sand grains, to say that the plankton were all the same anatomies when they are showing changes throughout the geological columns, right? So that when they weren't the same anatomy, there were differences. They had different sized shells. They had different ways they sat in them. Some of them used gas for buoyancy. There were all these different components to all the plankton.
Let
right?
me clarify that then, because I didn't claim that they were all the same anatomy. I'm sorry if that point was misconstrued. I was saying that they're all around the same size scale. Like if we're talking about like forams or something, they're all like around the same size and around the same density, right? Like that, like for diatoms, they're all going to be making exoskeletons of the same density from calcium carbonate. So it's going to be around the same density, even though you have different shapes and different patterns. They're all around the same size, around the same density. Like they would be hydrologically sorted just as a total mixed bag if water was going to be sorting these things. Like water can sort things based on density, based on granule size, etc. But that's not the kind of ordering that we see in the stratigraphic record or in like biostratigraphy of fossil order. We don't see these things neatly sorted by density or size. For example, like trilobites have roughly the same like body plans. Like you might find like small variations between them, but roughly the difference between like one trilobite and another, they're going to have around the same density. They're going to be sorted by size by water. And we don't see them sorted by size when we actually look at the various layers. That's not how trilobites are sorted. So water is not a potential explanation for what is sorting these things.
Well, so a lot of the creatures, like, so we don't have them to observe them and examine them and see what the anatomy is, the differences, right? We can look at the fossils and we can see, oh, they look similar. But the fact of the matter, it's the same with turtles. We can look at the fossils and see, oh, they look similar. But we don't have these things to actually examine their anatomy. So when we say that water couldn't organize them hydrologically sorting, it's really a lot of speculation we have to jump into because we don't know what they were, how their anatomies were built, and if they had differences, if some of them were in their shell a little bit too much, some of them were, all these little things are going to make an enormous difference when the water's moving these objects. Every little nook and cranny is going to contribute to this, right?
I have a trilobite fossil right here. You can make out pretty small anatomical details from this thing. I mean,
but it's stone, right?
very well, but you can literally see like the individual points on this thing's eyeballs. Like you can see like really, really fine anatomical features. You can determine a creature's anatomy from a fossil record of it.
Well, you can determine its anatomy, absolutely, but its makeup, like what it's made of, right? Like these are differences. That's made of stone, right? We can't get in there and we can't see if this one was a little bit different than this one in this way, and that one was a little bit of different in and we see that so much with species, right? So many species have little tiny differences that to water, hydrologically sorting, would make all the difference in the world, right? So like even said, oh, you said the eyeballs. right? Even something as simple as that could make a huge, enormous change in hydrological.
It's really not going to make that big of a change for hydrologic sorting. I mean, it's not going to be that precise on any means.
And this is where Grayson really starts dismantling the flood model piece by piece, because the hydrologic sorting argument is supposed to be the big explanation for why fossils appear in ordered layers. Creationists claim the flood sorted everything by density, size, and habitat. It sounds reasonable if you don't think about it too hard. Grayson explains why it collapses. He said this: they're all around the same density. Even though you have different shapes and different patterns, they're all around the same size, around the same density, like they would be hydrologically sorted, just as a total mixed bag if water was going to be sorting these things. Let me break down why this matters. Trilobites are a perfect test case. They all lived in similar environments. They all had similar body plans. They all had roughly the same density. If water sorted them, you would find them jumbled together in the same layer. You don't. You find them sorted by species across hundreds of millions of years of rock. Water does not know what species a creature is. Water only sorts by physical properties, and this is why the flood model breaks the second you take a microscope to it. Then, evidence of God tried to escape with this. A lot of the creatures, we don't have them to observe them and examine them and see what the anatomy is. The difference is, we can look at the fossils and we can see, oh, they look similar. That's a retreat. That's him saying, well, maybe there's anatomy we can't see that would explain it. But here's what's wild about Grayson's response. He literally holds up a trilobite fossil on camera and says, I have a trilobite fossil right here. You can make out pretty small anatomical details from this thing. You can literally see like the individual points on this thing's eyeballs. And that is the part that absolutely stops the conversation. Because Grayson is not speculating. He's holding the evidence in his hand. Anatomical detail preserved down to the lens structure of trilobite eyes. These fossils are some of the most famous examples of compound eye preservation in paleontology. We're not guessing what they look like. We know.
But you can also look at organisms that like necessarily have the same density and interaction with water, like phytoplankton, the type of plankton that have to live at the very top layer of water because they need to photosynthesize. And so they need to live at that top layer. And these plankton don't have mobility. They're just going around with the tides, right? So they have to maintain a certain density in order to be constantly floating at the layer that they need to access the sunlight. So phytoplankton species all have to have around the same density just in order to do what phytoplankton do. And again, we can see in the fossil record for phytoplankton, we can literally see this success, like this faunal succession of species to species and species. Like if you give one species of plankton, you can accurately predict what species you'll find in the layers above it and what species you'll find in the layers below it. There is this pattern here.
Yeah, so we also, like during the flood, we also would have had the combination of salt water and fresh water. We would have had things being pumped into the water, like different CO2s, different kinds of components being pumped in, different gases being pumped in. All these things are going to affect buoyancies, right? So like we can go back and forth about the anatomies and hydrologic sorting and how it would sort it, but the fact is we don't know what chemical compounds were in the water. We don't know what these things were technically made up of, right? Like there are a lot of factors that are missing here, right? So the water can hydrologically sort sand grains in accordance with its makeup.
Yes.
So to say that it can't sort when we know that there's little variated changes in all of these organisms. And I agree, some of them are scattered throughout the whole column, right? But this could have been, affected by things like the water was shooting things around and it kept certain things to the top because of the buoyancy, and then some CO2 went off in the water, or salt water interacted with the fresh water and it, you know what I mean? Like there's all kinds of different options as how they can interact.
Sure. Well, personally, I don't think that any of those options are going to rescue you from this. I don't think any composition of water is going to magically sort phytoplankton by species or any dynamics within the water. But that's fine to have that as a hypothesis and to say, look, I I hypothesize that there's some dynamic about this water that could explain these observations. The challenge is then to go and test that hypothesis and find what dynamics could be driving this. And creationists, to my knowledge, have not been able to produce any results that would show us what would be actually needed to explain things. Like, let's look at the fossil footprints, because this I see absolutely no possible explanation for any dynamics about what's going on in the water.
And now, Grayson brings out the argument that I think genuinely ends this debate on the scientific side, because phytoplankton is the one example that has no escape route. Grayson laid it out like this. Phytoplankton, they're a type of plankton that have to live at the very top layer of water because they need to photosynthesize, so they need to live at that top layer. And these plankton don't have mobility. They're just going around with the tides. You have to understand what this means. Phytoplankton are locked into a very specific density range by biology itself. They have to float near the surface to get sunlight. That is their entire existence. So under a flood model, every species of phytoplankton should get sorted together because they all share the same density, the same habitat, the same physical properties. There's no way to separate them by water dynamics. But then Grayson drops the one line that should make every young Earth creationist stop and think. He said this: if you give one species of plankton, you can accurately predict what species you'll find in the layers above it and what species you'll find in the layers below it. There is this pattern here. That is the moment the flood model dies, because what Grayson just described is a prediction, a testable scientific prediction. You hand him one fossilized species, he can tell you what's above it and what's below it. That pattern exists because of evolutionary succession over deep time, not because of a chaotic flood that's sorted by density. You cannot get that ordering from water. It's physically impossible. Here's something worth knowing. This pattern, the faunal succession of species through rock layers, was actually discovered in the early 1800s by a man named William Smith, who was a devout Christian and a canal engineer in England. He had no atheist agenda. He was just a working geologist who noticed that certain fossils always appeared in the same order no matter where he looked in the country. That discovery became the foundation of modern stratigraphy, and it happened decades before Darwin published anything. The evidence for this pattern predates evolution itself. Then, evidence of God tried one last rescue attempt. Something about salt water mixing with fresh water, different chemicals, different gases, and Grayson shut it down with this: I don't think that any of those options are going to rescue you from this. I don't think any composition of water is going to magically sort phytoplankton by species or any dynamics within the water. And that's the reality. You cannot wave a magic chemistry wand and make water do something water has never done in any experiment ever conducted. The retreat into, well, we don't know exactly what was in the water, is not science. It's an admission that the evidence does not fit the model. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.